call the meeting of the Portsmouth City Council, a work session that's scheduled for today, June 13, 2017, to order. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Cherry.
Here.
Mr. Clark.
Here.
Mrs. Lucasford. Here. Mr. Moody. Ms. Simmons. Dr. Whitaker. Mayor Rowe.
Here. Our first item is Portsmouth Public Schools third quarter financial report. Dr. Patton.
Yes, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and members of City Council, this evening's first presenter is Mrs. Brittany Dortch, Chief Financial Officer for Portsmouth Public Schools, who will present the third quarter financial results for PPS. City Council, you previously received a hard copy of this report. The second presenter this evening will be Deputy City Manager Vincent Jones, who serves as the city's FOIA, or FOIA officer. Mr. Jones will provide an overview of requirements of the Virginia Freedom of Information Act. The Virginia State Code requires that any person elected, re-elected, or reappointed to any body to which FOIA applies to be provided with a copy of the state code related to FOIA and to read and become familiar with the provisions. Our goal is to provide you with the overview annually. There are typically changes after each General Assembly is closed. The third presenter this evening is Mr. Bob Baldwin, Planning Director, who will brief City Council on the Telecommunications Act of 1996. A cell tower use permit application will come before Council during your July meeting. And the second part of this presentation is the Wireless Communication Bill SB 1282 from this year's General Assembly. This presentation is a follow-up to a briefing you received in March and focuses on the impact of changes to local zoning authority. This is an issue that will come into the next General Assembly, that will carry over into the next General Assembly session.
Thank you. And so let's go to our first item, which is
Mrs. Dortch.
And will you come to the lectern? Welcome.
Good evening, Mayor Rowe, Vice Mayor Cherry, City Council members, and Dr. Patton.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here tonight to present the third quarter financial report. This report is based on the March 31st report that was previously approved and provided to City Council via the City Clerk back in April. So throughout this presentation, I'm just going to go through an overview of the budget report, and then I'll go into figures as it relates to the general fund and our other funds, and then I'll conclude the presentation with the discussion of average daily membership. Following the quarterly report, it's important to know that this is a cash basis report. So the purpose is really for us to monitor our budget throughout the year. Now, when it comes to the general fund, encumbrances are included. And if you were to look at our annual financial report that we do at the end of the year, that would be on a modified accrual basis. So there will be a different result if we did the monthlies on the same basis. So I just wanted you all to know that it's cash basis, revenue received, expenses paid as of a point in time. So taking a look first at the general fund. So this is a comparison of our annual general fund revenues based on what we've actually received as of the end of the third quarter. Based on the numbers at this time, about $106 million were received of the $149 million that's appropriated to us, and that's about 71%. Now, looking at our state sales tax and our state funds, we are not anticipating for us to get 100% of what is budgeted, and that is primarily due to changes within average daily membership. And again, I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. Looking at our federal funds, you'll see that we received a little bit more federal funds than we originally projected. And if you look at our other funds, that includes our monies that were reappropriated by the City Council from fiscal year 16, but this also includes fiscal year 17 other revenue sources. And examples of other revenue sources would be our tuition reimbursement that we get from TCC for our First College and our dual enrollment programs. Looking at the general fund expenditures, this is a comparison looking at the quarterly expenditure budget as of the third quarter and comparing that into the year-to-date actual expenses that have been paid, and also our encumbrances as of this point in time. So not going through each number, but you'll see if we look at instruction, our quarterly budget was $81 million. Year-to-date expenses paid was $71 million. Encumbrances were approximately $900,000. Now with our instruction category, that is mainly our instructional personnel, which work a 10-month contract from September to June. So every time in that first quarter, you have less expenses that are actually paid when you compare that to the second, third, and fourth quarters. So that directly impacts the burn rate of 65% that we experienced at the end of March 31st. Now, this is actively managed by the Budget and Finance Office, and we are anticipating this to be closer to 99% by the end of the year. Moving to our other funds. So for our grant fund, we had revenues of $9.1 million, expenditures of $11.4, food service $5 million, food service revenues $5 million, expenditures of $5.2 million. Textbook fund revenues of $800,000, expenditures around $200,000, and risk management revenues $13.9 million, and expenditures of $14.4 million. As I mentioned earlier, this is a cash basis report, so what you don't see reflected here is any receivables. And just kind of honing in on grants, that is a $2.3 million difference between expenditures paid and revenue received, but that is because we wait for reimbursement from grantors. And particularly within December through February, there was a delay with the state on reimbursements, so that's why the difference is rather large. But that has been corrected. Lastly, looking at average daily membership. So this slide is a comparison of ADM within Hampton Roads. The state actually released a report that showed all school divisions across the state, and I just took out all of the Hampton Roads cities to look at, what is being experienced by Portsmouth, but what's going on in this area as a whole. And if you look, all divisions except for Chesapeake have had a decrease in ADM. And if you were to total up the difference column, the Hampton Roads area has lost over 2,000 in ADM from March 31st, 2016 to March 31st, 2017. And that March 31st number is what our state funds and sales tax is based on within the fiscal year. So,
our ADM was the highest out of all of the region. Any particular research that shows why? I mean, the difference 290 with ours being the highest in the region. Any particular reason why Portsmouth has the highest drop?
I've actually listed Portsmouth just to make it easy for viewing. We weren't the highest when it comes to difference, but some things that I suspect are going into this ADM drop, not just for Portsmouth alone, but with this being a transient area, looking at Portsmouth alone, it doesn't seem like we're replenishing our graduates from high school with the number of new students that we have coming into the division. I would also probably say that, population growth may have something to do with it. So, I think there's a variety of factors. I don't think there's just one thing that's causing this.
Other questions? On your sales tax revenue, are you estimating that you're about $1.5 million behind? What is your projection?
For sales tax, I don't have that broken out, but between sales tax and state funds together, it's a little over $2 million.
And that's your year-end?
Yeah, that's my year-end projection, yes.
Other questions? Yes. Yes, ma'am.
I didn't have a question. I was going to make a comment in working with Dr. Bracy and Mrs. Dolch. When we look at when Mrs. Deutsch says that there are about 2,000 something in the area, well, we know we are large military installation. I mean, you look at, and so we know that in that 2,000 are families that are moving in and out as it relates to assignments. But as we know in discussing, we do not have a large percentage of our kids who are military connected, and hopefully in the future that will grow. But I think Mrs. Deutsch's point on our kids are graduating, but then getting the growth of the preschoolers and the other kids that are coming up in large numbers. And as we grow our market of new families moving in and more homes being built, that may help to increase. We may lose, how many graduates? About 1,000 plus this academic year of graduation, or close to 1,000. And then, in our preschools and first graders, not 1,700 or more coming in. So that we have to look at that.
Do we know what the potential school age population is
Potential school age.
for next year versus what we have enrolled in schools?
I don't have that information readily available.
Oh, I see. In the whole city. Mm-hmm. Okay. We could.
Your question is, what is the potential overall school age
Population.
versus the ADM?
Yes.
Right. Meaning those that are homeschooled, those that are in private school. I think we can get that number.
And I will add that, ADM is different than enrollment, where enrollment is, the number of kids who are actually registered within the school system. But ADM is, how often that enrolled child is coming to school.
Any further questions? Dr. Bracy, would you like to? Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's a number of school age
Again,
children.
thank you.
In Ports.
All right, well, let's go to item number 2,
Mr. Jones.
which is the Freedom of Information
Yes.
briefing.
Good evening, Mayor Rowe, Vice Mayor Cherry, and members of council. This evening, I will provide a brief overview of the Virginia Freedom of Information Act as it relates to conducting business for a local elected body. The Virginia Freedom of Information Act is a procedural act that serves as a guide by spelling out requirements that we need to follow. Specifically, I will highlight 2 sections of state code that cover open meetings and public records. The consistent theme in FOIA is openness. So as it relates to conducting public business, this means unrestricted access to meetings where public business is taking place. And for the sake of defining a meeting is the physical assembly of members of a body to transact or discuss public business. Okay. So with that definition, we're all clear on what classifies as an open meeting. Public work sessions such as the one we're in tonight, city council meetings, meetings of our public authorities, boards and commissions, when they have regularly scheduled meetings, those are automatically meeting the criteria for becoming an open meeting. Right? So if they are an open meeting, that means they have certain requirements that need to be met. And sometimes confusion can take place when it has to do with how many members of the public body are present and the location of the meeting. So as to the number of members that are present, the state code says that the majority of council or 3, whichever is less, would require us to meet open meetings requirements. And does the location matter? FOIA generally applies without regard to our location. An example I will use is recently you had a community meeting. We had to provide public notice for that because the likelihood of you discussing or being there to discuss city business was evident, and so that meeting followed our meeting requirement notice for open meetings. I'll now move on to some of the requirements that need to be met if it's determined that a meeting is an open meeting. Notice provisions. Regularly held public meetings must be posted at least 3 days before the date of the meeting is to take place. Meeting minutes are required. And not only are meeting minutes required, FOIA actually spells out that the date, the time, the location, the attendance, a summary, and any votes taken must be included in those minutes. Right. The next one, video and audio recordings. This one is actually not what you think. This one is about the rights of citizens to record by photo, audio, or video any public meetings. The authority council has per FOIA is you can designate where they can take photos or record video or audio, but you cannot limit their right to record the meetings. Voting. All votes must take place publicly. The code allows council members to have communication amongst each other to sort of poll each other where you are or your position on certain topics. However, any form of voting must take place in public. Right. And the last one has to do with our closed meetings. Closed meetings are allowed per state code, and the state code sets out a total of about 46 possible reasons for a closed meeting to be held. But generally, the ones that are familiar to city business are personnel related, property sales, privacy of individuals, economic development negotiations, or consulting with your legal counsel. And one of the new requirements as of 2015 is now after a closed session, you actually have to affirm that you discuss the identified topics during the closed session. Now we'll move on to public records. A public record is any writing or recording that captures a transaction of public business in any format. This is whether you created it or you are just in possession of it. One thing I'd like to add is even if it's in draft form that you're working on a document, if someone submits a FOIA request, those documents are going to be responsive and have to be provided as part of that request. FOIA does not require us to make up records in response to requests. A lot of times people will have an idea that the city has something, but they aren't clear on what the record is. We don't have to make up a record to be responsive to that request. And if I could, I would just like to take this opportunity to just remind council that with the use of electronic devices and portable technology, the records requirements still apply. So often I know we use multiple devices and email addresses. So if you are subject to a FOIA request and you have transacted public business on multiple devices, then they will be subject to search for responsive records. So I would encourage you to just limit your transaction of city business to a city cell phone or a city email address. That way, if you are subject to a FOIA request, that we know specifically that we're looking at that one email address or one device. All right. Now I'll move on to making a request for records. State code indicates that FOIA is for Virginia residents and representatives of the media that have circulation in the state or if they broadcast in the state. So the second bullet, you'll see that requests need not make reference to FOIA. Often we get requests that begin with under VA FOIA or per VA FOIA, I'm requesting information, and that's not needed per state code. Finally, requests are not required to be in writing. Residents can make verbal requests for information and still can be considered a request under FOIA. However, the city can request it in writing, but it can't make a requirement. If we ask somebody to put it in writing to make sure we're all clear about what we're asking for, they can refuse. And so we try to capture those things just to make sure we're on the same page. When we get a request that falls under FOIA, the city has 5 working days to respond to a FOIA request. It is important to note that there is a distinction between 5 days and 5 working days. Working days does not include weekends or holidays observed by the city. So as an example, if someone requested a document on yesterday, which was Monday, the 5 days starts today. Friday would be the 4th day, the 5th day would be Saturday, but since that is not a working day, Monday, next Monday, the 19th would be the 5th day for filling that request. There are 5 permissible responses to a request. I'll just quickly go through these. 1, we can provide the records as requested. 2, we can withhold the records. If we withhold a record, we have to identify under what authority of state code we are using to withhold those records. That's called an exemption. Number 3, we can provide records in part and withhold some in part, and the same thing applies for those records that we are redacting or not providing. We now have to explain what those things are and how much information they are not receiving that we found that was responsive to their request. The next one is no records exist. Oftentimes, like I mentioned before, people have an idea that the city may have something. Sometimes they're on a fishing expedition, but it might not necessarily be a full record. And so we will respond with no record exists to their request. And the last one is we can request an extension of an additional 7 working days because the records cannot be provided within 5 working days. We are responding to FOIA requests as we conduct our daily business. Sometimes staff get busy, or sometimes requests are for large amounts of data. And in that case, the code allows us to request an extension to fulfill the request. FOIA also requires us to provide responses in writing. With the updates made by the General Assembly in 2016, responses must now include a description of what is being withheld, what exemption allows the record to be withheld, and how much information is being withheld. FOIA actually has some penalties as well. If a court finds that a violation was willful and knowingly in violation of state code, fines can range from a minimum of $500 to no more than $2,000 for the first offense. And for any subsequent violation, penalties are not less than $2,000 and not more than $5,000. I would like to add that these violations are not against the city in general. They are against a specific officer, employee, or member of the public body. Okay. And that brings us to the end of my presentation. If there are no questions.
Thank you, sir.
Questions? Oh, yes. Thank you.
Just have one comment that we spoke of today was persons who are in public settings, and I guess that falls under video. Now the live stream, or the what is it called? Live stream.
Facebook Live.
Well, I didn't want to say Facebook, but live stream. And with that, as Mr. Jones had indicated, some entities have determined that, I may live stream, but there is somewhere in the area or videotape that we've designated for that to be done. But the live stream is a whole new way of information getting out. May not be the best visual information, but live streaming is going on in our meetings.
All right. Paige.
So if a request comes into the city manager's office and it doesn't meet the deadline, you're saying the city manager is responsible for it?
Well, they don't come to my office.
For example,
If it came to me.
if it came to yeah.
Right. So right.
So the fine wouldn't go to the city, it would go to the city.
Right to the individual. Right. who is responsible for providing those records. So somebody is a custodian of the record.
That's a lot.
Bill?
I noticed one of the first slides mentioned the notes. The meeting of a public body requires the taking of notes. Does it exclude public work sessions? And the reason why I say that, I've always advocated notes being taken because really the only record of this meeting is video. And a lot of times this is where the sausage is made and it's where tasks are committed and we delegate things to members of staff and memories between meetings can get foggy and a lot of times nothing gets done. I won't say a lot of times, but frequently. That's the same thing as a lot of times. But anyway, the only record of that is to go back to the video, which is cumbersome, and certainly the public doesn't have those minutes. So what is it? The way I read that is every meeting of the public body requires notes being taken. Is that correct or not?
Well, I will ask the city attorney to assist me, but I'm not aware of
Exemption.
But I don't want to speak out of turn, so I'll let Mr. Ashby assist.
Mayor, Vice Mayor, and members of council, it does require minutes. It does not necessarily require notes, but if notes are taken, then...
Well, minutes is what I'm referring
right,
to.
Yes, there are minutes required for any public meeting. You're correct. And those, as Mr. Jones mentioned, have some specific details to those. Certainly, everybody's minutes may vary quite a bit. Of course, our clerk provides very extensive minutes with regard to these meetings. When you get to committees, they may be a little bit more sparse. But yes, if there's a public meeting, there's a requirement for minutes that will meet those essential details set out by the state law.
At the end of each public work session and every city council meeting, the video is watched completely by a documenter on our team that documents every assignment, every request, and then on Wednesday, which we go and as a team meeting and deal with each request, and that's your report backs. It's actually what you ask for that come out of the notes that are taken from the review.
Well, that's similar to minutes. The only difference is it's I've never seen those, and I don't think the public has access to that either.
Mayor, I'd like to add to what Dr. Patton just said. The Wednesday following council meeting, my staff from beginning to end watches the video and with specifics to the public work session, and we note in your minutes action items that are requested by council members.
Double check.
And that's been going on for a while. So if you take a look at your minutes, you'll see that there actually, if a council member specifically asks for information, it is noted in your minutes.
That's sort of, kind of like minutes. That's more like...
Well, we don't do verbatim minutes. Right. We do action minutes. So we're not, every conversation is not noted.
Are they public?
Yes, sir. It's in the minutes.
I mean, are they posted online like the rest of our minutes?
Yes, sir. With your agenda package.
Okay.
Other questions? Dr. Whitaker? Okay. Everybody good?
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. This brings us to zoning considerations. Two slides.
Again, good evening, Mayor Rowe, Vice Mayor Cherry, and members of council. Have just basically two items I want to brief you on. They're related. related to telecommunications and relates to our zoning code. And one thing I just want to mention before I get started, a lot of people may not be aware what the limitations are of our zoning authority, but our zoning does not extend to the right-of-way. Our zoning authority extends up to from the property line. It's private property. Once you hit sidewalk and into the right-of-way, that's covered by another chapter of city code. So in some communities, their zoning actually extends to the center line of the street. So just to make sure you understand, in Portsmouth's case, we do not do that. Our zoning line does not go past the right-of-way. So when you're dealing with some of these telecommunication issues, location, whether it's in the right-of-way or whether it's zoned property, makes a big difference to us because we don't have overlapping authority. We do have a telecommunications tower use permit in process. This will be coming to you at your meeting in July. Went to the Planning Commission earlier this month. And looking at our records, it's been about 5 years since City Council's had a briefing on telecommunication towers, because there's some nuances to the way we handle telecommunications that are different from your standard use permit, in which City Council has a very broad authority. In this case, and if you kind of take yourself back in time, back in mid-1990s during the Clinton administration, there was a big push to promote the telecommunication industries, primarily for cell phone use, not for data streaming and all of that. But in order to promote a national objective, there was a Telecommunication Act of 1996 adopted, which really sets about the rules upon which localities operate when doing permitting. And again, this is primarily was dealing with large cell towers. And of course, you drive around the city, you'll see we have a number of those around. And over the years, most localities, including Portsmouth, have adapted to their zoning ordinances to these types of facilities, have processes in place both for co-locating on existing towers, co-locating on buildings, as well as when we do a use permit requirement, someone wanting to put up a freestanding tower. So the application you'll see next month is a freestanding new tower. So before that gets to you, I wanted to run through very quickly some of the guidelines you operate under federal law in dealing with these use permit applications. Probably the most important one is number one, and that is decisions denying telecommunication towers must be in writing. And so, a lot of times when council has a use permit and you decide to deny it, you just make a motion to deny it, second it, you're done with it. But in telecommunication tower, that's different. So if you're going to deny the application, as is recommended by the Planning Commission in this case, keep in mind you're going to have to do that in writing. We'll talk a little bit in a second about process for that. The other thing, just very quickly, to deny the requirement is they must be supported by substantial evidence. You may not adopt regulations that prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting these kind of facilities. And back in the 90s, that was a very popular thing to try to do, to act like you're allowing and then try to zone them out of your community. A lot of places did some of that. You can't discriminate against functionally equivalent providers. You can't pick and choose. We like Verizon. We don't like T-Mobile. We're going to have a different set of rules for them. You have to act within a reasonable amount of time. You can't get an application, sit on it for months on end. We have a process we follow anyway that does that, but there is a limitation on how long an application can sit. And then the last one, which is one that was a very big deal back in the early days, you're preempted from regulating the basis of environmental effects of radio frequency emissions. There were a lot of cases back in the 90s, people claiming health effects from the cell towers, and so the Telecommunications Act, it prohibits localities from denying based on perceived or suggested health effects. So that's kind of the guidance of the bill. I just mentioned when you get the staff report, you're going to get a much more detailed set of information. We followed the guidance from the Telecommunications Act of 1996, so we drafted the staff report so you can follow your way along. What I want to sort of hit on here, the last part, is this number one. And this gets back into city council process, and I'll let the city attorney jump in if I get too far into practicing law here. But what happens when this thing gets to the city council should you decide to deny? And I guess we don't predetermine. We've got conditions in the staff report if you choose to approve. But what happens if you get there? And there's really two options. One, you can follow your normal process. You could take your initial vote. You could recommend denial, come back for your second reading, and at that time, the city attorney's office would draft up a motion, an appropriate motion, which lays out your reasons and rationale in writing why you'd recommend denial. That's one option for you. Quite often, we know City Council doesn't like these things to come back on a second reading after they've denied on the first. And so what we would suggest in that case is that the city attorney's office go ahead and draft up that document before your first reading. So then in the event City Council does not want it to come back for a second reading, you could ask for that the denial recommendation in writing prior to your first reading vote, so you would already have that in hand. Just want to point out to you, we don't want to get caught in a situation, I've seen this happen in some localities, where you don't follow that, and that's if you have to go to court over that, that's a real problem for you in the court and you haven't followed the process that's been laid out. So that's really the point of the presentation. This first item tonight, trying to give you a sort of a preview, since it's been so long since you've had one of these applications, and to answer any questions you might have about how this federal regulation affects our local authority. I would want to mention one thing, which is a lead in my second item, is in that first statement up there that it preserves local zoning authority. I think that's important to remember. Even though it's giving guidance, there's no preemption of local zoning authority. There isn't, a federal requirement saying you can't process this with your zoning. It just sets up the sort of the rules of the game for denial and for processing. So that's all I have on that. If you have any questions.
We do. Bill.
Yeah, Bob. Number 6 there, I remember in the, I guess the late 90s, that we had 2 cases. One cell tower wanted to locate in a schoolyard. Mm-hmm. The other one on the athletic field. Council denied both of those based on, I guess, citizen objections. Some cited the radio admissions as a health hazard, some just the aesthetics of having a tower in a schoolyard or on a ball field. Was that in effect there, and would that prevent us from making a similar decision nowadays?
Well, I would just say that requirement's been in effect since 1996. I'm sure it was in effect at the time, but bear in mind, that's if that is your sole reason. And the one thing we would tell you when you look at these things, think about the broad view you take about land use, about compatibility and appropriate transitions between, say, residential and commercial or industrial properties. And there's a large number of land use reasons that are both described in your comprehensive plan, also in the zoning ordinance, that are used if you're applying your zoning authority correctly. You don't need to drop down to number 6 and say that's the only thing we've got. If that's the only thing you're denying for because of that, that's problematic. But generally speaking, what you're just describing there, compatibility with school use or compatibility with neighborhoods, all those things, those are all very legitimate zoning considerations that are used throughout the country on these kind of applications.
Good. Thanks.
Other questions?
Yeah, go ahead. One question I had is, in zoning, I don't know, like I've never been involved in one of these, but I know there's other local jurisdictions that have these cell towers that are disguised. Mm-hmm. There's one that looks like a pine tree in Newport News, and there's one that's a flagpole in Norfolk. Is that something that we can address if it was an area we chose it to be something disguised?
Yeah, we've looked at that over the years. What people find most times the disguised tower looks worse than the actual tower. One of the things that people have moved away from, I go back in the 90s, there were a lot of what we call lattice work towers. They're much bigger. You saw the kind of like the Eiffel Tower structure to hold these up. Now we're more on a monopole, much less visually impactful. We do a lot of screening at the ground level with landscaping, and now you can't screen 165 feet high. We kind of grasp that, but you try to do the best you can at kind of eye level from the ground. But trying to disguise something that's larger than any tree you've got growing in the area tends to make them stand out if you can see it. I would just mention years ago I was working in Colorado and they tried one of those in an area where they just stood, they got this giant pine tree sitting out of a group of aspen trees, and people pretty quickly said that doesn't work. You do a better job with disguise. They can put them in like church steeples and other larger buildings, and that gets done, and they can be in some cases hidden in there. One of the things we've been very good at accomplishing in this is co-locating. So you take the one tower, you might put 3 users on it. So instead of having 3 towers, you've got 1. So you reduce the impact that way. But we do attempt to do a pretty aggressive job of screening at the bottom and also trying to make sure they're in as good a location as you can find one.
change.
I just want to say that if the city attorney was so inclined, the rationale laid out for the planning commission's denial, if the council was to agree with that, would be the basis for what he would write up.
That's correct. And that would be the point that I think the planning commission's rationale, the rationale that's been provided in the staff report becomes, if council were to agree with that, want to go in that direction, that would become the rationale for a written. And of course, you had other things you wanted to add to that. You're certainly able to do that, but that would certainly give you a written, same thing the staff used. We followed these guidelines for ourselves, so when we wrote up our recommendation, we followed those requirements in crafting our staff recommendation.
That was my question too. The criteria for the resolution for us to deny, we want to follow the recommendation from our planning department. But one other add to this was that there were some alternate locations that was recommended to.
Right. And without going through all the details of the other staff, one of the things we were concerned about. Not only were we uncomfortable with the location selected, we believe there were other locations that the provider could have of research that may not have been as perfect for them as they kept indicating. That was their sort of perfect, spot. But it could have served a similar provision of service to their customers and would be less impactful on residential neighborhoods, really more in commercial areas or closer to the interstate. In that case, trying to find a place where the compatibility with residential districts was our number one area we try to protect from these things in the first place. Keeping in mind the balance you try to get to telecommunication providers, that's their customer base back in those neighborhoods, so they're trying to get close because they have a lot of demand for service there, so we try to balance that.
Have the courts defined the term substantial? Item 2.
Yeah. I can't really speak in terms of doing a lot of research on previous court cases. I think that's something I'm sure we could get some information with the city attorney's office on that.
I don't think that we could answer that right now, Mayor, but we feel as a team that we're going to become inundated as 5G comes and everybody from T-Mobile to this, as Mr. Baldwin said, trying to get closer to their customers. And we're just trying to get ahead of the curve because they are going to be coming. They're already at the door, but they're going to be coming.
Has the General Assembly given us the authority to extend our zoning into the right-of-way?
Yes, you have the authority to do that. We have found here, and I've worked in localities that do it both ways, you end a lot of regulatory confusion. I'll give you an example. On a telecommunication tower, they had a case in Newport News recently where their engineering and permit and Public Works office, I believe, issued a permit for a tower, and then the zoning office came in and charged a zoning violation. And so you can get some very confusing overlap. The authority to go to the center line exists. You just have to be careful that you're not acting in cross purposes with other things. There are other, and I just mentioned there are other elements of code where the city has different authority than you'd have under zoning. Zoning is a very limited amount of authority in comparison to what you can do within your own right-of-way. And so quite often you're better serving to protect your right-of-way as opposed to trying to protect your right-of-way through zoning. But it certainly can be done.
Other questions? Okay.
Well, we'll move on, and this goes back to what Dr. Patton was just alluding to, what the General Assembly is doing. And this, as opposed to the previous one where I was talking about the Telecommunication Act preserving local zoning, I go down here to number 5 at the bottom, and we kind of get down to some of these things. We're talking about preempting local authority. And really what you're seeing happening at the state level is the opposite. We're starting to see efforts from the industry to preempt local authority. Now, back in March, you had an earlier presentation on small cell, micro cell, pre-5G kind of deployment for telecommunications devices. And there was a lot of activity went on in the General Assembly, and Senate Bill 1282 was adopted. And in that case, it has separate sections there. It deals with both the right-of-way as well as on zoned property. So there's actually sections within you can look and see what how the state was and the industry, in fact, was approaching this. From the zoning perspective, what you see happen in the current bill isn't that impactful this year. They did a few preemptions for co-location, which would be if you put a facility on a water tank or on an existing building, on existing poles that are covered under your zoning ordinance. The state says those have to be allowed as a co-location. Our zoning ordinance already does that. You already have a co-location provision in the current zoning code, so that's not an issue. After a lot of the debate that went on during the General Assembly session, the question about new poles or new towers, as we were just discussing a few minutes ago, those provisions were taken out of the bill that was adopted. So it's silent on new poles on zone property. Now, I think back in March, your provision you saw you had a lot of discussion going on about the right-of-way, putting up poles or using street lights or power poles and all of those kind of things that are typically in the right-of-way. From the zoning perspective, current code or the current bill adopted this year was silent on new poles. They do have some specific processing time frames, and quite frankly, a lot of those were taken from that Telecommunications Act from 96, so they're kind of borrowing a little bit out of there. They did preserve the fact that if you're in a historic district, you have to go through the design review process under the zoning authority in there. But I just mentioned number 5, which is really the sort of the critical thing. Is we already know the industry is planning on coming back. I've already seen a draft of a bill that's been presented to VML, which goes back into the question of poles, and in this case, the industry looking for preemptions where they would have no restrictions on placing poles up to 60 feet high by right. There's some discussion there about kind of back and forth about tower authority and time frames for processing some of these towers. If you look at it as a whole system, not just the sort of the finite level at the street, but all the way up through their towers, they'll continue to use these towers. So there is a very active push to preempt local zoning authority for these facilities on zone property, and I think that's going to be the order of the day for what will go to the General Assembly in 2018. I've just started looking at the VML bill. I haven't gotten through all the nuances of it at this point yet, but definitely they're looking for expansion, like how many facilities can they submit with one application? I think the number's 35. But the issue that we're really more concerned with, both in the right-of-way but also under the zoning, is this issue of all the poles. And one reason is that there's no requirement for co-location. There's no provision for co-location. So if you start thinking about getting these poles lining up, we're thinking every provider, if you see one, if they're in a location where there's the demand for service, you're likely to see more than one. So this is a pretty serious preemption effort, in my opinion, in terms of telecommunications and being able to regulate both within your right-of-way and property that's covered by a standard zoning. So that's what I think we're looking for going ahead. Again, I think the fact that they're working through VML, this is a statewide issue. I've seen discussions across planning departments across the state, people looking at this. I don't know what the end result will be on the public side, but I think this is really an attempt to put back into the bill what was taken out last year as they negotiated their way to the end of the session. And that's really all I had. I just want to give you that heads up that that's going to be, and in my judgment, one of our bigger planning and zoning items for the 2018 General Assembly session.
Questions? I have a question that's primarily for the city attorney. Back in the old days, the way cable TV was regulated in Virginia was through a franchise ordinance under the provision of the Constitution that said if you're going to use the public right-of-way, a wharf, an alleyway for a period greater than 15 years, you had to get a franchise. How does this square with that?
The anticipation is that many of the pole applications for 5G or 4G could be consummated through a franchise agreement. And so, as Mr. Baldwin has said, some folks are now inquiring as to whether or not the city is open for a franchise agreement to deal with some of these new technology and placement of such technology. So it is still the opinion that it would require some sort of franchise agreement as it sits right now. And the new legislation attempts to intertwine these new regulations with that existing constitutional requirement with regard to franchise agreements for services over long periods of time.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, Commissioner? Thank you, sir.
The only other thing I would add, Mayor, is so you may see in short of period of time and short of January 2018 discussions about potential franchise agreements and terms so that we address these zoning issues. Certainly the city has a couple of different zones. Some areas, all of our poles and whatnot are underground. Some areas, they're above ground. And as we have these applicants come forward, we are going to have to come to you for some determinations with regard to long-term policy with these types of agreements.
Well, this is for my colleagues on council. Do we want to be in a preemptive or reactive role?
I think preemptive.
We need, before they change something that we have no control over.
I thought I might have the answer to that. Well, should we ask the city manager and city attorney to frame up something along those lines?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Everybody in agreement?
Yes.
Anybody in disagreement? Okay. All right. Thank you. Brings us to City Council liaison reports, and start with Bill.
Well, the only thing, the Personnel Committee, the appointee evaluations are due today for colleagues. And also, since we met last, the Personnel Committee at one of the boards and commissions, the Vice Mayor will be talking about that later today.
Okay. We'll have a closed meeting on that.
Yes.
The reports that I have for PRHA, you already saw it in the news that the PRHA board has hired their new executive director. His name is Mr. Edward Bland. He comes from the Ohio area. He will begin on July 20th in his new role. I will be meeting with the PRHA board on Thursday. The updates you already know. All of the Swanson Homes residents have all relocated back to their Swanson home property. They're still working on fixing some of the problems that were there. They are anticipating that they should be done within the next 30 days. They are also with the Craddock. We talked about that property at Craddock last time. And, of course, I reported that the only information that I had was that the financing had fallen through. And in speaking with the board and the directors there, the information they had with their special meeting was about Edward Bland. But I did speak with the director regarding the Craddock property just to be able to bring more information back to you. And the financing did fall through with one of the partners with the Ryan Homes. They have since found another developer, another partner that they will be working with. They have told me that they should have some information on that by the end of this week. They should know what that is, and hopefully they can have some action coming out and coming before us in the public in end of August. But we should get more information at the meeting that I go to on Thursday. So that's with PRHA. We've already heard pretty much of the Planning Commission reports that we had. There were two public hearings, one for, of course, the towers that were at Victory, and it is the recommendation of the Planning Commission to deny. And the second item was for a substance abuse treatment center, which I will speak with the city attorney. I may have to recuse myself when any discussion is held on that because it is for a substance abuse treatment center, and it's going to be in a location that we currently have up for sale at 2700 London Boulevard. We we have it up for sale or for lease, and there's a tenant that's interested in leasing that property for this use. And so the recommendation came from planning. You'll hear about that, was to approve that, but I will be recusing myself from that. So that's all the updates that I have.
Thank you.
Okay, how much? Because Councilman Moody gave the personnel lead, Councilwoman Burke gave, Lucas Burke gave the Planning Commission, and you heard the EDA yesterday, but I will reaffirm the EDA did take approved 2 facade grants, one for the Monument of Churches, you heard, and the other one for Cafe Europa. You heard about the grants yesterday, and he also talked about the fact that they had a letter of intent for Lincoln Street, as well as the former library in Churchland. So those are the big things that they, and they wanted to remind everyone about the grand opening tomorrow for
Harbor Vista.
Harbor Vista.
4 o'clock.
4 o'clock tomorrow. That's it, ma'am.
Thank you.
I don't have anything updated for the Hampton Roads Regional Jail, and our Parking Authority Board will be held next Tuesday night on the 20th, so I will provide an update after that meeting occurs.
The report that I have, HR TAC will have its annual meeting this week, which will be the election of officers. So we'll probably get a new chair out of that. I don't know who's being nominated. At a meeting this past month of the HR TPO, Virginia Beach tried to get the region to agree to add one more construction project, and that's improvements at the interchange of Independence and 264. And the region said essentially no. Well, not, they said no. And we'll add this to the second round of things to be studied with no guarantee that it's going to make that. As you know, the first round are the improvements on 64 on the peninsula, the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, the improvements of the interchange at 264 and 64, and the high-rise bridge. Okay. With that, we have a need for a closed session, and may I have a motion, please?
I move to go into closed meeting pursuant to Virginia Code subsection 2.2-3711A.1 for the purpose of discussion and consideration of potential candidates for appointment to boards and commissions.
Is there a second?
Second.
We have a motion on the floor. It was duly seconded. Any discussion? Madam Clerk, will you call the roll?
Yes, sir. Mr. Cherry?
Yes.
Mr. Clark?
Yes.
Mrs. Lucas-Burke?
Yes.
Mr. Moody?
Yes.
Simmons is absent. Dr. Whitaker?
Yes.
Mayor Rowe?
Yes.
We are in closed. Thank
We
you.
are in closed.